It's not uncommon, to put it lightly, to find Jewish Americans well represented in the legal field. But the conventional storybook narrative of how Jews rise to occupy positions of promise and prestige in the law tends to emphasize the gradual softening or quieting of religious observance in favor of a broader, more secular American identity. I remember back in 2010 when Elena Kagan had been nominated by President Obama to serve on the Supreme Court. In response to a question from Senator Lindsey Graham about a domestic terrorist event that took place on December 25, 2009, Elena Kagan, then Dean of Harvard Law and since 2010 a Supreme Court Justice, Elena Kagan explained that on that day, quote, like all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant. It was funny and charming and played perfectly to the room and the cameras looking on, but Elena Kagan's remark also illustrates, to me at least, precisely the sort of culturally Jewish, secular sensibility that you would not be surprised to find in elite positions like the ones that she's held. Of course, there are religiously observant Jewish lawyers, some of them extremely accomplished, some of them having contributed greatly to the American constitutional order. But my guest today is not only a lawyer, he is a federal judge who represents a different model and a different sense of identity, one in which deep Orthodox commitment and distinguished public service not only coexist, but reinforce one another. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. Judge Matthew Solomson was elevated to the federal bench in 2020, and last month, the president designated him as the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims. Rather than abandoning his Jewish observance and Jewish devotion in the name of secular citizenship, Judge Solomson is staking out a different path, and his example suggests that America is strengthened when citizens bring their deeper commitments, including religious commitments, to bear on public service. The questions his career raises touch on the very nature of American democracy, the meaning of Jewish life in America, and the possibilities for religious citizens to serve the United States in a secular age. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Judge Matthew Solomson. Judge Solomson, welcome to the Tikvah podcast.
Thrilled to be here.
So, look, I'd like to begin by asking you to teach us a little bit about the Court of Federal Claims. This is not a court that I suspect most of our listeners know a lot about, and I think it'd be helpful in the beginning of our conversation to just understand the nature of your work and the kind of things that you're thinking about and making decisions about all day.
Sure. So let's back up and just I'll provide a brief overview of the federal system. And again, I'm going to keep it high level. There's a lot more nuance to all of this, particularly with various administrative tribunals. But in general, there are 3 levels to the federal system. Most people or all your listeners are going to be familiar with the Supreme Court of the United States, colloquially called SCOTUS. Right? The Supreme Court of the United States sits at the top of the food chain. All cases funnel up to them, but for the most part, the Supreme Court operates by writ of certiorari, where they will only take the cases they want to hear. One level down are the United States Courts of Appeal, the Circuit Courts of Appeal, and the Circuit Courts of Appeal generally operate by regions. So, for example, the Fourth Circuit covers, amongst other states, Maryland and Virginia, North Carolina. New York is within the Second Circuit. California is within the Ninth Circuit. Florida is in the 11th Circuit, etc. And then beneath that, what people are most familiar with are the district courts of the United States. And those, as the name implies, are even more limited geographically than the circuit courts. So you have the District of Maryland covers the state of Maryland. The Southern District of New York, if I'm not mistaken, only covers Manhattan. maybe some surrounding parts, but already Long Island is the Eastern District of New York. You'll have this, Eastern District of Texas or the Northern District of California. But their subject matter is very broad. District courts hear criminal cases and civil cases, and they even hear some types of cases against the government under the Administrative Procedure Act or under the Federal Torts Claim Act. Um, but then there are three national courts that are not bound in any way by geography. And the three national courts are my court, I should say my court, the court in which I serve, the United States Court of Federal Claims, the United States Court of International Trade, which is located in Manhattan, and our mutual appellate court, the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, whose judges sit on the two floors above me, and who also has, which also has courtrooms in our building as well. And so the national courts have a more narrow subject matter jurisdiction, which means the types of cases that we hear are not as broad as what the district courts hear. It's not as broad as what the regional circuit courts hear on appeal. But our jurisdiction reaches the entire country. So if you have a case that falls within the jurisdiction of the Court of International Trade or the Court of Federal Claims, and most often it's exclusive jurisdiction, meaning the case has to come to us. So what are some examples of cases that must come to us? Procurement disputes are probably the largest category of cases. The federal government is the largest acquirer of goods and services in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And the process that the United States uses to buy goods and services is often subject to dispute, whether because a potential bidder or offerer does not like the terms of the game, often contained in what's called a request for proposals, or because they don't like the outcome of the procurement. They didn't win a contract and they think there was a flaw in the process. So those kind of challenges must come to us. Um, and
Does that include military and defense related acquisitions?
all federal agencies. So yes, I've had defense acquisitions before that are been subject to challenge before me that are worth over $1 billion. There are $20 billion procurements. There are huge procurements, and if they're
So everything from buying computers and software to buying airplanes and aircraft carriers.
yeah, there was one suit involving well, it was a contract claim. That is a claim for breach against the government involving a well-known fighter, and it went on for 15 years or something, and it went to the Supreme Court at least once, maybe twice, but it started in our court. So that's kind of the other side of challenging a procurement is you win a contract and then you have a fight with the government about, say, how much you're owed under that contract. So if you sue the government on a contract that you've won, let's say for breach, that also comes to us. If it's over $10,000, it must come to us. If the suit is for less than 10,000, it can go to the district court or it can come here. We have what's called concurrent jurisdiction with the district court for some of those cases. But there are also contracts that the government enters into with private parties that are not procurement contracts, meaning it's not the government buying goods or services. There's a famous category of cases that arose in the, I want to say, late 80s and throughout the 90s called the Winstar cases, where the allegation was that the United States government induced solvent banks to acquire insolvent banks with the promise of how the banks would be able to treat certain types of capital. And then Congress got rid of that preferred treatment, and the banks all came to this court seeking damages for breach. Now, that's not a procurement contract. The government's not, in that case, acquiring a good or a service, but that doesn't mean there's not an agreement between, say, I don't remember what it was, whether it was the Treasury Department or the FDIC and these banks. to be able to, that induced the banks to acquire these insolvent institutions. And when Congress disallowed the preferable treatment that had been negotiated, these banks all came here and sued in some cases for hundreds of millions, or maybe even in excess of $1 billion in some cases. And that case went up to the Supreme Court, where the government had argued that the government was immune on this type of suit, um, due to certain complicated sovereign immunity principles. And the Supreme Court said, no, you've got to honor the contract. And if Congress via statute abrogated those contracts, then it has to pay damages. Um, there are yet other classes of cases we have, anything where basically almost any suit for money against the federal government that does not involve a tort comes to us. So that includes any statute or regulation that commands the payment of money to a particular party. The latest class of large dollar cases that have come our way have been from the Affordable Care Act. So, one piece of litigation that went up to the Supreme Court involved the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known colloquially as Obamacare.
Mm-hmm.
Another category of cases was whether the government had to pay certain sums of money to insurance companies that participated within the Affordable Care Act scheme. That also went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sided with the plaintiffs and said, yes, these provisions that everyone is suing on are called money mandating provisions. They mandate the payment of money, if you fit within the class defined by the statute. And so our court has been resolving those slowly but surely as to whether or not, these plaintiffs claiming money under the Affordable Care Act are entitled to the sums they claim. Um,
But it's fair to say that the commonality is that in each and every case that appears before your court, some bureau, some branch, some department of the United States government is the defendant.
Correct. The United States is always the defendant in our court. That is true. Yes. And then, there's a whole nother facet to our court that is actually people have likely heard of, but they don't know it's a part of our court. There's the vaccine program. So it's gotten a lot more attention post COVID, but a long time ago at this point, Congress worked out a deal with the vaccine manufacturers where people who allege that they are injured by a vaccine, instead of suing the vaccine manufacturers for an alleged tort or harm due to a vaccine, is that they can come file a claim against a fund that the United States manages. And that kind of a claim goes to a group of what are called special masters who work for our court. They're appointed by the court, not by the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, although all of the judges are. The special masters are not. And they decide in the first instance whether someone is entitled to compensation for an injury due to a vaccine. And then we hear appeals from those special masters, from either a claimant or the government. That's another category of cases we handle. But we handle anything from intellectual property claims against the United States. Tax claims can come here. Certain types of civilian and military pay claims. Another large category of constitutional claims that we have are what are known as Fifth Amendment takings claims. So, much of what you hear about in the news is the government goes to take someone's property for some public purpose, and they'll sue about the legality of the taking. Let's say there's no controversy over the legality of the taking, but what the plaintiff alleges is you have in effect taken my property and I am owed money, because the Fifth Amendment promises just compensation for the federal government taking property. So they'll come into our court and say, hey, the government's action by doing X is they've taken my property and we're owed money. and we have a lot of claims under that theory, that type of claim.
So you were recently elevated, having served as a member of this bench since January of 2020. You were recently elevated to be the chief of it, and I'm guessing that your predecessor did not wear a kippah and have to sign off at the right time on Fridays for Shabbat, and was not living an Orthodox Jewish life the way that you are. In fact, there are not very many observant religious Jews who occupy your stature in the federal judiciary, and I wonder if you could just talk about what it was like for you to get this appointment and this elevation.
Well, there are two different things. As you noted, I joined this court back in 2020, in early 2020, and that process was a long, arduous process, from interviewing, at the White House, after President Trump came into office the first time, followed by extensive background checks, FBI background checks, DOJ, that is the Justice Department, does a professional background check. And if you kind of make it through all of those processes, the Senate does their own review of you. And then you have to sit for a Senate confirmation hearing, which you can find on C-SPAN. And then once you get through that, you've got to be voted out of the Judiciary Committee onto the House, onto the Senate floor, and then you have to wait for the majority leader of the Senate to schedule time for you to be voted on by the complete Senate for confirmation. And that whole process took over 3 years to happen, for me. So it was kind of a long, long, winding road. And I can say, kind of in total candor, I never wore a kippah or a yarmulke, depending on how you want to call it, professionally, until I was nominated and had to decide what to do when going before the Senate. And I asked the Justice Department handlers, those are the lawyers who prep us for the confirmation hearing, whether they thought it would hurt me or not. And they said, nope, do whatever you're comfortable with, and it will not affect you in the confirmation process at all. And I think we have in some sense come a very long way. The shores of these United States have always been hospitable. Um, well, with limited exception, have been always hospitable to the Jewish people and to Jews fleeing Europe, certainly after the war, and after World War II. And although my family has been here since the late 1800s, I don't think any of them could have imagined being able to be visibly Jewish, um, in any public office, let alone a higher public office that involves a presidential appointment. So, I took the OLP lawyer's guidance to heart and said, well, this is who I am. If it's not going to hurt me, and the experts say it's not going to hurt my chances, then I might as well, show who I am as a person, and kind of a core part of my being. So they were right. It didn't prove to be any sort of issue or obstacle to get Senate confirmation. I was confirmed by a fairly wide margin, and I think it was something like 89-8. So and I doubt any of the 8 who voted no had concerns because I identify as an Orthodox Jew. I doubt that was their problem. Although who knows? Um, and
Let's go back to that moment of decision, because I find it interesting that, see, you could imagine somebody sitting in your chair telling a very different story, which says, I used to be more particularistic. I used to be more observantly Jewish, but now I sort of feel that I'm thrust into the American public square, and so it's incumbent upon me to be more general, more universal, to lose my particularism, and in a way to take off my kippah. And you had the exact opposite. You reasoned your way to the exact opposite conclusion. And I want to just understand how you were thinking about it.
Well, I think part of it is a very technical, halachic Jewish legal reasoning. There's a wide range of debate about how serious or important the requirement is in Jewish law to cover one's head as a man. That itself is somewhat debatable as a historic matter. But in general, I think kind of the common practice or widely accepted view within the Orthodox Jewish world from right to left is that earning a living or the risk of loss to your family, if you will, your inability to support your family, would be a reason to take off a kippah or a yarmulke and not be identifiable as an Orthodox Jew. But and I guess if if for lack of a better word, fear during the initial 15 or 17 years of my practice was was a concern about whether people consciously or unconsciously would hold it against me in some way or another. And I just didn't need um, my faith to be the first thing people thought of when they met me,
Hmm.
in any context, in any business context. But then when I started to consider what is the nature of this job, the nature of this job is that you know um, there are the president had already nominated me, and the senators are sophisticated people who, like I said, I really don't think anyone at the end of the day was going to vote against me for that reason. Um, and the concern about earning a living kind of evaporated. There's also no promotions in spot really. I mean, once you're in this spot, you're in this spot, and it's not like at the end of the year, Congress decides, whether we all get raises or not. There's no bonus to be made, um, and so I just all of the excuses that I once had in the commercial sector, in big law firms or in big companies, kind of evaporated for this particular position. And I also thought to myself, um, if I can be outwardly identifying as an Orthodox Jew and show younger lawyers that this path is possible, then that's something I would like to do. Now, I had a concern too that I actually spoke about with a friend of mine who's a mentor, a rabbi, and also a lawyer, about the question of what we call Chilul Hashem, which is, loosely translated as desecrating God's name.
Hmm.
The fear is that you do something wrong as a Jew, particularly one that's visible, and um, people will ascribe that to Jews generally, and maybe even God himself. Like, this is the kind of person who claims to be religious and yet acts in this poor or demeaning or disappointing or dishonest way. And what I said to this rabbi, as a friend of mine, is that's a lot of pressure. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. Lawyers do things to upset judges in court on a somewhat regular basis. I don't want to have a negative reaction that then reflects badly on the Jewish people, on our religion, or as the saying goes, or on God himself. I don't want to do that. You know, Maybe I shouldn't be wearing a yarmulke. Maybe it's just safer that people don't see me in that way.
I
And
want to just pause
yeah,
and underscore this because this is a very important distinction. It's not that one would feel bashful about wearing a yarmulke because of the judgment of non-Jews and their condescension. It's not that at all. But the concern about Chilul Hashem, the idea of desecration of God's name, is in some ways the opposite. It is precisely because one is putting oneself forward in a way as an emissary and representative of the religious world that one fears that any kind of misjudgment or error of something like that will be seen by the non-Jewish world as representative of the Jews and Judaism and God, and therefore it's to take one's role as a representative even more seriously, to give it more honor, not less.
Yeah, that's true. Let me just push back on one of the premises of that extended question that personally, I don't know anyone who is not Jewish who would have that attitude about Orthodox Jews. I mean, not in my world. And I have, I would say, a large number of friends, both personal and professional, who are not Jewish, certainly not um, people who are intimately familiar with Orthodox Jewish practice, and I have never ever had any sort of issue with them by virtue of my religion or how or wearing a yarmulke or something like that. So that but the rest of your description, I think about Chil Hashem is dead on. That is the concern. That was the question for this rabbi who happens to also be kind of a peer age-wise, but is wiser than I am. And I said, so maybe I should avoid this problem.
Hmm.
And he said, no, you're not responsible for people thinking badly of Jews or Judaism so long as you act reasonably. Now that doesn't, and that should mean that you should be extra careful about, not acting wrongly, but as we all should. That should be an extra oomph, push to be more careful. He said, but as long as you're acting reasonably, if other people are going to uh, be extra picky about you because of that, that's kind of not on your head. And then he did say something to me kind of funny, which is, and by the way, there are a lot more wealthy and important Orthodox Jews than you are who also wear their yarmulke around. So if the rule were really that you had to worry about this stuff, none of those other people would be wearing their kippahs, their yarmulkes, and they do. So
Hmm.
he said, grain of salt this a little bit. Just be careful when you're in court that you treat everybody fairly and with respect. But yeah, from time to time, we have lawyers who misbehave. They're either disrespectful in court or they're disrespectful to the court, or they're disrespectful to their opposing counsel, or they violate or potentially violate ethical rules, and we have to step up and do the unpleasant business of, engaging in some sort of disciplinary orders or the like. And, could that cause someone to think negatively about more than just yours truly? I mean, I guess that's possible, but that's the rabbi's point was, as a moral matter, that's not on you. And so, I think I've just tried my best to it's just the old like kind of New York Times test or Wall Street Journal test. Don't do anything that you wouldn't want splashed on the cover of the news, and don't do anything that wouldn't make your mother proud. So, it's kind of common sense, and I've tried to do that. I'm sure I'm not always perfect, but um, in general, I'm happy with the decision I made to be identifiably Jewish. That's
So maybe this is a good opportunity then to enter into your own Jewish formation. And let me just ask you, you've had for those of our listeners who are sitting in New Jersey or New York or Illinois or California or other concentrations of very dense Orthodox Jewish life, um, I'm pretty sure that they've had a background that is very different from the background that you've had growing up. It's an amazing American Jewish story. Just tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess well, I could spend a long time on childhood, on the couch with a shrink or something, but that's a joke. But to kind of just in brief, my family was largely centered since the late 1800s or early 1900s in rural Connecticut and Hartford, Connecticut. My father joined the Army, first as a dentist and then became an oral and maxillofacial surgeon in a residency at Walter Reed here in the District of Columbia when I was very young. And he and my mom made the decision uh, to stay in the Army for a whole career. So, um, I did not grow up Orthodox. Grew up in what I would call a very traditional home. Every time we would move in the Army, the movers would say to my mother, hey lady, why do you have 9 sets of dishes?" And of course, it was milchigs and fleischigs for regular and for Pesach, that is for Passover, and 2 sets of china for Passover and 2 sets of china for regular. I mean, it was Ein Sof, as they say. There was no end to the number of dishes and utensils for milk and meat, etc. So we kept the kosher home. But we moved around a lot. Um, let's see, before I was in 8th grade, I lived in Louisiana, Texas, West Point, Silver Spring once, Savannah, Georgia for 2 years, suburbs of San Francisco for 1 year, 3 years in Hawaii, Augusta, Georgia for a year, and then back up here to the DC suburban area, the Metro DC area.
Yeah, needless to say, not all places with very dense Orthodox communities.
Correct. And yeah, again, I didn't grow up Orthodox, but my father got special permission, for example, when we were stationed in Savannah to live a little bit further away from the Army hospital he was assigned to so that we could be in a larger Jewish community. And they sent me to Jewish schools when they could, namely in Maryland and in Savannah and in California. But in Hawaii, there was no such thing. I went to a year of public school for the first time in my life, and then 2 years to a kind of an elite prep school called Punahou, where President Obama graduated from, a big prep school on the island of Oahu. Um, and then bounced a little bit between a private school in Georgia and then finished up in public schools in Potomac, Rockville, Maryland. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess I grew up, in the conservative movement, if you will, which I don't think is any longer very conservative, if it ever were. Um, then I applied to, I don't know, God knows how many colleges I applied to. I applied to 20 something universities, some reach schools, some, sure things, a lot in the middle. And I was accepted to quite a number of really good schools. Usually those reach schools never pay off, but I got into one of those too. But in that process, my father actually made me apply to Brandeis University because he said he had wanted to go there as a high school grad, and his parents couldn't afford it. But he said, I can afford it, so I would like you to apply there. And I said, I'm
Hmm.
really not interested. It's going to be like Jewish camp for
Right.
college, and I've done camp, and I don't need camp, and I have no interest. And he said, well, if you want me to pay for all of your college applications, you've got to apply there too. And I was accepted to Brandeis, but like I said, I got into much better schools. And I visited all of them. University of Michigan was too big for me. Um, the highest reach school I had gotten into was Johns Hopkins. I visited there and was like, "Oh, I could come here. I'm going to get run over. Well, I don't know how I got in, but I shouldn't have been let in. This is not for me."
Mm.
UCLA was too big and too far. Um, and one by one, I kind of crossed out different schools, some, equally good, if not better than Brandeis, but I visited Brandeis with one of my best friends at the time, still one of my best friends, um, who happens to be Catholic, and we both fell in love with Brandeis. And I guess good thing my father made me apply there because that's where I wound up going and where I wound up meeting my wife, and that's where I ended up becoming more observant was at college. I just had uh, a lot of modern Orthodox friends there who were post yeshiva and seminary for the most part in Israel. and I had a lot of questions, and in the end was persuaded to make a little bit of a different journey.
Did Israel play a role in your imagination growing up? Was that part of your family story?
Yeah, I mean, my father would always describe himself, and to this day would say he's a Zionist. They took me to Israel on at least one major trip with a friend of mine. My father had volunteered on a kibbutz there doing surgery, and he had
Mm.
volunteered for the IDF post-retirement from the American Army in a military hospital doing surgery. Um, my wife and I spent time there before I went to law school. I was in yeshiva there for a bit. Um, but I don't think it ever really crossed my mind to move there at all, really. I mean, if I'm being honest. And it's a hard thing to explain to people not within Judaism or the framework of Judaism, to explain that for most people who do move to Israel, American Jews who move to Israel, it's a religious imperative. It's not really a political statement um, for the most part. It's not a reflection of their feelings for the United States. But my dad served in uniform for over 20 years, and I grew up, if not living on military bases, which I have, in and around military bases. And um, I understand kind of the religious implications of what I'm about to say, but I can't shake the feeling. I'm an American first, and I feel that in my core. Um, and this comes up. It came up with, in a sense, with Judge Barrett when she was in her confirmation hearings. This sort of suggestion. No one comes out and asks it directly, but there's always this suggestion that somehow because of your religion, you have a divided loyalty. And not only do I reject that, but I would go further and say, well, listen, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to apply its laws as written and fairly to the parties before me. And if there were a moment where I felt that for some reason I couldn't do that, my obligation would be to resign in order to fulfill my oath. Thankfully, that's never been a question uh, presented by any case that I've had, nor is it something that I really feel in my heart would ever come to pass. Um, so yeah, I guess I think it is complicated for particularly observant American Jews who serve at high levels of the United States government about how they think about Israel. But like I said, I think just being, as I can't claim to have worn the uniform, but being an Army brat or being an Army wife or a Navy wife or however you want to say it, or a Navy brat, it's in your guts. Um,
So this is a portrait of very deep American devotion and American patriotism, and it explains some about your desire to enter into public service in some very senior way. But now, what we have here is that once you are um, confirmed by the Senate and are already serving on this court, all of a sudden you do start to invite judges to take trips to Israel because you think that there's something that they can learn from the messiness of Israeli politics and Israeli society and the Israeli judiciary. God knows what a mess. So I want you to just explain to our listeners what was the idea behind the organization of the pre-October 7th trip that you took, and what you thought you were going to learn, and why you invited these other judges to accompany you.
so yeah, just to set the stage, back in March of I guess it'd be 2024. Um, 14 or 15 federal judges, including me, took a trip to Israel largely to study the after effects um, of October 7th. say after effects, but that's kind of not exactly accurate. People are still living, October 7th every day there, so long as there are still Israeli, Jewish, American hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. I think people are traumatized every day from the experience. So if some way October 7th was the start of October 7th, a long October 7th that has kept going, um, that was not the original trip that I had had in my mind long before October 7th, while Israel was in the middle of the uh, heated disputes, political disputes that Israeli society was having over what has been called judicial reform. Um, I thought it would be a good idea to organize a trip for judges just to learn about their judicial issues and provide some feedback from our American perspective. I thought that would just be a useful and interesting trip. Judges routinely engage in these types of trips, particularly when, as I understand it, a little bit before my time in the legal sector, but when the Iron Curtain fell and a lot of the Eastern European countries were standing up their own governments and their own court systems for the first time, American judges were brought over on what are called rule of law missions to consult with governments on how to do rule of law properly. Um, and because of our unique position within the federal system of being the main stop for claims against the government, that's a feature that doesn't exist in every part of the world where you can sue your own government for money. So we were frequently, judges from my court were frequently on those trips, is kind of my historical understanding. Um, I know that there were also rule of law trips to Afghanistan and Iraq when we had forces there to try and help those countries set up a Western style court system. Um, and so my idea for this Israel trip was, hey, let's they're engaged in this massive, legal discussion about how to structure what's the proper role of courts in society. Um, Maybe we can go learn from them and they can learn from us, and that'll be an interesting trip. And I had mentioned it to a few people on my court and a few other friends, like, hey, it would be nice if we could figure out a way to do this. I think I had spoken to Tikvah here and Tikvah in Israel and related Tikvah groups in Israel about how we might put together such a trip. And then 10/7 happened. And, my interest and everyone's interest in judicial reform went out the window. And then the question was, well, is there still a need for such a trip with a different focus? Between the protests that we saw start against Israel before Israel even fired a shot in return, right? The protest started on like October 7th +2 or 1. And Israel hadn't done anything, and people were calling for ceasefires. Um, I pivoted my interest away from the academics of law and policy and towards, is there something for us to do um, that we can do for the bar and legal education here in America by visiting Israel? Um, and from there, it was just a question of lining up the pieces. I had this idea, but there was at least one other judge who had the exact same idea. Judge Roy Altman in the Southern District of Florida had the same idea, and a colleague on my court put me in touch with another Jewish judge, Lee Rudofsky in the Eastern District of Arkansas, and we got in touch with Judge Altman in Florida, who put us in touch with Judge Luck, who sits on the 11th Circuit also in Florida. And between the four of us, we started to try and brainstorm about what we might want to do. How could we get this done? And eventually, another friend of mine who works closely with the World Jewish Congress, who's a lawyer, said, "Hey, I think I have the an approach that could make this happen." And so in the end, we took this trip of a lifetime. Um, of it was, I think it was evenly split, 7 federal trial court judges, 7 appellate judges, 7 Jewish people, 7 non-Jewish people, and
Appointed by Democrats and Republicans.
I'm not as sure as to the exact split. We certainly tried very hard to make sure that there was a diversity of appointing presidents. Um, the balance was not as much as we would have liked on the first trip, but I believe there has been another trip since then, and there's another trip being planned. And I know that that is a priority to have different philosophical views represented and different, appointing presidents represented. Although I've got to tell you that no judge, once they take the robe, once they take their oath of office to be a judge, thinks in those black and white political terms. You kind of do a mental switch. I'm not saying that people don't have intellectual prior commitments and beliefs and philosophies that they just kind of flush down the toilet and become schizophrenic and they divide their brain in half. But what I am saying is that we don't think in those starkly political terms when we interact with each other. Certainly not when we do the business of the court.
Right.
And so, I mean, I know that there were, you know, that the judges in our trip were appointed by different presidents, and we all got along great and had a truly life-changing, fantastic trip. I feel a little bad about it. On the one hand, I'd say this when I came back from that trip, I'd say it again, like in the order of important things in my life, I would say, marriage and children, um, my service on this court. I'm just talking about me. The
Yeah.
government, the nation doesn't need me here, right? There's 100 other people who can do this job just as well. But for me in my life, I mean, this is an experience and an honor that I never thought I would have. So I put that number two. And just beyond all of those things, I would say is this trip we took to Israel. And I feel bad about that because I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish it had been the judicial reform trip, more legal in nature. In the end, we had big highs in Israel and we had, very shallow lows, very, very poignant moments, very gut-wrenching moments. I think I've spoken to you about this before, but one of the things that we did on this trip was we watched this 47-minute video of the October 7th footage that has not been released to the public. And it was truly awful.
But in a larger sense, when you're thinking about inviting federal judges to join you for this trip, what's your purpose? What do you want an American, Jewish, non-Jewish, doesn't matter. Somebody whose job is to protect the American constitutional order and make sure that the law is fairly and judiciously applied equally to American citizens. What do you want that person to come away from Israel with?
Um, well, I think there's a few preliminary um, steps to agree on. One is that judges are not, there are some aspects of our professional lives and professional ethics which points towards the monastic, right? We in some sense we are separate from society insofar as we're not allowed to go to political rallies. We're not allowed to make political contributions. Your First Amendment rights, my First Amendment rights are not the same as yours. There are things I can't write about. I can't write an op-ed supporting a particular political candidate or a specific policy that's being debated, in Congress. I can't do that. Um, on the other hand, our code of ethics recognizes that judges play a role not only in society broadly, but also in particular in the legal system, and even more particular within legal education. So there's nothing controversial about judges being invited to give talks on all sorts of legal and legal adjacent issues at our nation's finest law schools. And that's an old tradition. Most judges do that. I would say many judges I know do that once, twice, 5 times a year. It's just a very common thing to do. Um, so, with the four of us organizing this trip, thought to ourselves is, you're seeing the campus protests against Israel and the United States' support of Israel. We're not going to take sides or express opinions about the First Amendment line between speech and action. Those are matters that could come before some of those judges. We're not going to express an opinion about that per se, but there's a Talmudic saying that says something along the lines of "Eno doma shmiya l're'iyah." The hearing something and seeing it for your own eyes are incomparable.
Right.
And so the idea was, to the extent these issues of 10.7 are being debated within the legal academy, and the legitimacy of Israel, or war crimes issues, or use of force issues, um,
You want to be able to see it.
Sorry, right, you want to go see it.
Yeah.
So the idea is, let's take a group of judges where the focus is going to be largely on, civil society's reaction to the war. Let's see it. So, we had the opportunity to meet with commanding generals and, the senior officials within the military legal advisor. I mean, one of the things we watched was a video showing strikes being called off because the IDF made an assessment that the collateral damage didn't justify the strike. Now, who was it called off by? You're listening to this video and you can hear the communication between three people, and who's calling it off is the lawyer. The lawyer is saying, no, no go, abort. Now, best as I understand it from my friends, many of whom were senior lawyers who served in the military and who I've talked to about this and have confirmed this, in our system, the military lawyer, the operational lawyer, gives advice to a commanding officer. Sure, the commanding officer may ignore their advice at their own peril, meaning you make the wrong call to fire when the lawyer told you that there's a problem. If you end up as the commander not being right, I don't know, maybe you get in trouble for that, and maybe the lawyer's advice to you is properly evidenced to say, hey, why did you make this different call? But in Israel, there is a certain amount of command authority that is ceded to the lawyers. So when those lawyers say no go, it's not optional. You are not allowed to fire. You are not allowed to say, well, I assess the situation differently, I'm taking the shot. You cannot. And we were all very struck by that while we were there, the degree to which lawyers have operational control and the degree to which they're really concerned about international law in a way that I'm not sure that the United States is quite as obsessed with. So our impression was that the Israelis are really very concerned with notions of international law, despite, some of our skepticism, um, meaning like there's no, which tribunal is going to adjudicate whether you broke international law? And, so a lot of these are principles without, statutes and regulations. International law doesn't work the same way as a country's law works. There's
Right.
no,
Right. Certainly without the enforcement mechanisms of a country's law.
right, there's no real enforcement
Yeah.
mechanism. So, everyone kind of, abides by these principles. And, I don't know enough to opine, good, bad, how it should work. I'm not an international legal scholar by any stretch. I don't know the ins and outs of that area. But I think it is fair to say we all walked away with the sense that um, they were making some calls that might have not been in their own best interests because of these larger considerations of international law. And then, the chance to hear from survivors of the attacks and to see that 47-minute video and to ask questions to the team that put it together. That kind of upfront exposure, you start to see what a terrorist attack looks like. That's not just a bus bomb. I mean, it was horrific beyond your imagination. You really couldn't come up with some of this footage. And even now talking with you, it's really hard not to cry because it was that bad. When I tell you we left that room after that 47-minute video, you know, you had 14 federal judges or 15 judges, all of us grown men and women who just were in total shock. I mean, it was hours before anybody could talk to anyone else.
Hmm.
Just traumatized just from the video. Imagine living through it. Um, so, you know, if judges are going to campuses where kids are going to protest at their arrival for talking about, you know, whatever, then judges should be equipped to say, no, I was there and I saw it and this is what happened. That's part of that's, I think, fairly within the scope of the legal education that we are often asked to provide on an extracurricular or even a curricular basis.
Right.
So
So I want to pivot to another area of your leadership. Whereas there are times, as you said before, that judges are called upon to adopt a monastic distance from the cut and thrust of American politics. Nevertheless, there are some areas in which you feel you have a special responsibility to lead. And I want to ask you about the boycott that you organized following the October 7th, not attacks in Israel, but the protests as they started to get going on campuses. I want to ask you about the protest that the boycott that you organized, um, where you got the idea, how it's been implemented. Just tell us about what you were thinking.
yeah, one of my friends and judicial colleagues has given me credit for what has been called the Columbia boycott, but I don't know if that's entirely fair. Um, you know, and depending on your view of it, you'll call it generous, or maybe you say throwing under the bus. I don't know. But let me back up also to the days and just short weeks in the aftermath of 10/7. There was a letter coming out of Harvard that a bunch of Harvard student groups signed. Um, and it was expressly in support of Hamas. It blamed Israel for the victims on 10/7. It was victim blaming in the worst form, and support of a group that is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States of America. And I saw that and I just said, well, how can I send a signal that this is just beyond the pale? So I just did a relatively short LinkedIn post saying, I'm not going to hire anyone who is even a member of those organizations. If you're a member of an organization that signed that letter, you know, you don't even bother applying to me. Now, I don't know how many people are applying to me from Harvard, although I'll say that, you know, in my 5 years on the bench, I've had law clerks from Harvard, Penn, NYU, Pepperdine, Notre Dame, Georgetown, GW, Maryland, right? So I hire from a large range of schools. Some of them are your truly excellent, you know, top 10 law schools. Um, and I just said, you know, if I can move the needle a little bit by making this statement, you know, maybe others will join and we'll show the country that there are certain views that are beyond the pale. Now, I didn't view that as political because I didn't say anything about a candidate, a congressional policy, the
Right.
wisdom of a statute, a regulation, a court case. I just said, I'm not hiring you. And we have kind of very, very broad discretion when it comes to hiring people. And
Hmm.
I think that being a member of one of these organizations is just disqualifying every bit as it would be if you told me on your resume that you were a member of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not hiring you. You may have a First Amendment right to join the KKK, but you're out. Um, and so, you know, I thought that this letter was so disgusting that it deserved the statement. Now, to be fair, um, it's almost laughable. I don't know anybody who would hire someone who signed such a letter. And I had one colleague come in to my chambers here who worked on anti-terrorism litigation when he was a lawyer for the House and the Senate. And he was like, I'm sorry you even had to say something. I never would have hired a person with one of these organizations on their resume. So
Hmm.
I'm sorry you felt like the need to say something, but I promise you I wouldn't, I don't have to do that. I would just throw the resume out. Um, okay, that post got picked up by the press, and made a fair amount of legal news. Um, Other judges, Judge Radofsky made similar statements, um, about who he would hire. But there was no boycott per se. In fact, one of the reporters asked me, "Hey, did you join the what's known as the Yale Stanford boycott?" And that boycott was by Judge Jim Ho on the Fifth Circuit and Judge Lisa Branch on the 11th Circuit, and they both said that they would boycott hiring from Stanford and Yale because of those schools' treatments of conservative students and conservative speakers who came to campus and were shouted down and harassed and essentially not permitted to exercise their First Amendment rights to speak. Um, and I said, I don't know how I feel about boycotts. I'm not such a huge fan. It's they tend to be over inclusive and capture people who didn't really do anything wrong. And I'm not talking about a boycott. All I'm saying is that if you effectively sign this letter, or once you found out your group had signed this letter, you didn't withdraw from the group, to me, that's a statement that you sympathize with Hamas, and I'm not hiring you. That's not a boycott. Um, that's a consequence for a position. Um, and we kind of forgot about it, right? That news died down. And then Columbia University got out of control. And at the point at which Columbia and UCLA in particular were out of control, um, I wanted to do something else. What else can I do? I already
Right.
did this thing. What more can I do? So I sent a note to those two judges who boycotted Stanford and Yale, to Judge Ho and Judge Branch, and I said, "What can we do about Columbia?" And a few days later, I get a phone call back from Judge Ho, who uh, who said to me that his initial reaction to my request was that he already did his thing with Yale and Stanford, and he can't run a crusade for every last offensive thing that's going on campus, and he's fought his fight already, and he doesn't need any part in this. And then he said to me, he thought about it, prayed on it, went to sleep, and woke up with the feeling of, and said to himself, what kind of person would I be if I stood up for conservative Christians, and not my Jewish brother, and not, I quote, my Jewish brothers and sisters. So he said he then resolved that.
Needless to say, Judge James Ho, born in Taiwan, I think, not Jewish.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. And that was his point, was that he stood up for people that he kind of generally agrees with, um, um, and that he stood up for like he said, conservative Christian speakers on campus, and you know um, felt the need that he couldn't just abandon his Jewish brothers and sisters on campus, and that's what he said to me, and very moving, uh, you know, personal testament to his character. But then I said to him, okay, well, what do we do? And he said, well, I think we should, extend the boycott of Stanford and Yale to Columbia. And my initial reaction to that was, I don't love it, but I couldn't come up with something after debating with him for a while, that would move a needle. And he also told me something very another thing in defense of the boycott strategy that has resonated with me then and resonates with me today. First of all, I want to tell you, I got a half a dozen notes from current Columbia students saying thank you.
Hmm.
They were glad for any pressure that would be brought to bear on the campus administration. Um, I don't think I received any notes from any Columbia students that were upset with me. I'm sure there were, We did make the Columbia boycott prospective only. So whenever we started it, we said this doesn't apply to students who are already there, but only to students who matriculate in the following year.
Hmm.
And as to the critique that the boycotts are over-inclusive, um, Judge Ho makes a very strong point in my view. He says that that's a loser's mentality. What do you mean? You assume the boycott isn't going to be effective. And because the boycott isn't going to be effective, you don't want to participate because that would mean you're only hurting good students because you're not achieving the goal of the boycott. And now there are 15 judges, who however many signed that boycott, who are not hiring Columbia students. And so all of the well-behaved students of, someone used to mean particular Jewish students, but it could be anyone who's just well-behaved,
Right.
who would otherwise be qualified, is now being hired. Um, but Judge Ho is correct. If 50 judges had joined the boycott would be over tomorrow because we'd win. It'd be over.
Hmm.
The campus would say, the law school administration would say, okay, uncle, what do we have to do to fix our house so that you'll remove this ban on hiring our students? And then lo and behold, you'd be able to hire everybody again. Um, so it's only this kind of self-perpetuating negative mindset that you can't move the needle that causes people to not join. Um, I think he's right. Um, but I am convinced that it had other salutary effects after we made the Columbia ban public. That's when a lot of law firms started piling on and looking at applicants' social media and seeing what kind of things they were saying and doing, and whether they participated in these encampments that block Jewish students from campus, etc. And so I think that in no small way the boycott helped shine a light on what was going on campus. I mean, the news media was doing it, but every little bit helps move the needle. People like Bill Ackman, and others who have been very active about publishing their letters to various college administrators and pulling their funding. Um, it all helps. I'm glad we did it. I hope that the campus will change and we can go back to hiring them. Um, you know, um, but yeah, that's kind of the story.
Judge Solomson, in just under 2 weeks' time, you are going to be welcoming about a dozen legal fellows that are part of Tikvah's legal fellowship, a fellowship of which you serve as the intellectual leader and dean. And I just want to bring our conversation to a close by asking you how you thought about when you're thinking about that program and what you're going to be doing with Tikvah's legal fellows, what you think rising Jewish lawyers. I mean, most of the people in this program are in their rising into their second year of law school. If they're going to integrate their Jewish devotion and American patriotism, and if they're going to put these two parts of themselves together in service of the United States as you have, what you want them to think about, what you want them to read, what you want them to learn and study, who do you want them to meet? How did you think about that program?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I work as closely with you on the Tikva Legal Fellowship, and I think it's just a fantastic program that I've been, as you mentioned, involved with since its inception. As kind of a junior faculty member, if you will, just delivering a short talk on the road to the bench and some career issues. Um, but what has developed is really just kind of your next generation of accomplished Jewish lawyers. Right now, they're just in law school, but their resumes are incredible, and they're going to do great things, whether it's in business or in government or in philanthropy. These kids are all going to make a difference in uh, in American civic life, one way or the other. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think in developing and a lot of the curriculum that we've had in past years, I think served as a good basis for planning this year's. But I think what I've tried to do the most to change things up a little bit this coming summer is I think the best education is not reading someone's 100-page monograph on a topic or another book, although that's always, great to do. The more books you read, the smarter you are. Um, but to expose people to leaders who are already operating at that level. So, we've tried to get um, and we'll have hopefully a number of senior federal judges serving on circuit courts and district courts, and senior House and Senate staff lawyers, both Jewish and not Jewish, senior members and leaders of major think tanks here in Washington, an opportunity to meet with senior officials within the White House. Um, and these are all accomplished for the most part lawyers. Um, and I think when you see what other people have done, what their career trajectories look like, you can either discern some patterns and commonalities, and even if you can't do that, you can at least see that it's possible and
Hmm.
see how you can accomplish things. I know one lawyer working in the White House who said, "It's incredible when I work here and I pick up the phone to make something happen, it gets done." You're working in the bowels of some agency. That's also great work. I spent 5 years as a line trial attorney at the Justice Department. They were a great 5 years, very professionally fulfilling. But in the end, I'm kind of towards the bottom of the totem pole, and I'm given cases, and I have a job to litigate those cases. We're talking about people who are making policy and effectuating change at a very high level, and to have the opportunity to expose our Tikvah fellows to that kind of group of people, and to show what is possible with their careers. Hopefully, it'll open their imaginations beyond your initial decision as a lawyer. Should I be a transactional lawyer, and do deals, or should I be a litigator who fights fights? And you don't have too much of a conception of all of the other paths that are out there. And so I hope, for the most part, we're helping them develop networks. And as you know, the Tikva Legal Fellowship also partners with the Blackstone Fellowship, and while we have between 10 and 15 fellows, the Blackstone Fellows, which is a Christian fellowship, has over 200 fellows. So, it also gives them an opportunity, our students, to expand their networks beyond the Jewish groups that they might be very involved with on campus. It gives people a chance to expand their perspective and figure out, where do these Jewish groups have common cause and common views with other people who are not like them in some respects. And in the end, part of the hope of that is you find out that your differences are a lot smaller than you think.
This conversation was recorded in May 2025. Judge Solomson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.